Hi guys! Today we are going to be talking about energy transfer in ecosystems. A fancy way of saying food chains, food webs, how the organisms on Earth in the ecosystems around the globe get their energy and transfer their energy. We maybe remember last year we talked about the law of conservation of mass that says that matter cannot be created or destroyed. The same is true for energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed either. So when we look at energy transfer, we're looking at the energy that's changing position or changing to a different type of energy. So what do we mean by that? First, we're going to be talking about organisms that are in a system, an ecosystem. An ecosystem is all the biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living factors in an area and the interactions among them, right? So if you look at the diagram there of the tree, right, that's a living organism. If we look over here, water is non-living, right? So if we remember our terms, living, those are going to be biotic organisms. Those are things like the tree and the fox and the squirrel or chipmunk, right? And then the non-living parts are things like sun, right? Energy from the sun. Clouds, those are non-living. Rain, water, those are all non-living components or abiotic factors in an area. We're going to be looking at how all of these parts of an ecosystem interact to help form food webs and food chains. The first thing we want to remind you of, because we did talk about this a little bit already this year, is what an autotroph is. An autotroph creates its own food through the process of photosynthesis, right? We call them producers a lot of times in food webs and chains because they produce or create all of the food, not just for themselves, but also for heterotrophs, right? If we didn't have autotrophs, we would not have life on this planet. Remember when we read the Max Axiom book and we talked about that meteorite that hit Earth that decimated the dinosaur population? The original reason, right, is because it blocked out the light so plants couldn't grow anymore, so there was no food. So without plants, no life can exist on this planet, right? Because we eat plants, rabbits eat grass, chickens eat corn, all organisms eat plants at the base of their food web or food chain. Some examples of autotrophs that you might be familiar with are things like plants and algae, rose bushes, cornflower, corn plant, tree, right? All of those are autotrophs. They create their own food using energy from the sun and the process of photosynthesis, right? Just a reminder that all energy flow is going to start with the sun because all energy comes from the sun. The energy that powers photosynthesis originates as radiant energy from the sun. Plants convert that into chemical energy. That's why we have this chemical equation that represents the chemical reaction that happens as a result of photosynthesis. Now, for those of us that are not autotrophs, we're called heterotrophs. That means that we must consume food because we cannot make our own food. So a word that we use to sometimes mean the same thing as a heterotroph is a consumer. When we're looking at our food webs and food chains, you might see the word consumer. And we're going to talk about different types of consumers in a minute. Some types of consumers are animals, right? Things like rabbits, giraffes, mushrooms. I know you don't think of mushrooms as being a heterotroph, but mushrooms actually secrete a type of acid that breaks down decaying matter and absorbs those nutrients. So even mushrooms are heterotrophs. Here's just some examples, right? We've got our deer, we've got our frog and our dragonfly. Those are both heterotrophs. We've got our mushrooms, our fungi, we've got our little bunny rabbit. All of those organisms pictured have to go through consuming food in order to survive. So let's talk about the different types of consumers. We have scavengers and detritivores, and those are fancy words for organisms that feed on the tissue of dead plants or dead animals. We think of these a lot of times as vultures, right? We see them on the side of the road. If something gets hit or killed on the side of the road, we see vultures often eating it. Shrimp are like the little scavengers of the ocean. We talked about crawfish. Crawfish are also eat detritus or dead plant or animal matter. All of those are types of organisms that are consumers. We call them scavengers or detritivores because detritus is dead plant and animal matter. So here's a couple more pictures of some organisms that consume dead organisms. Herbivores. Herbivores, you've probably heard this term since maybe third grade-ish. Herbivores eat only plants. They're the vegetarians of the world. They're things like cows, elephants, giraffes, koalas. All of those organisms only eat plants. So they are called herbivores. Herb like herbs that you cook with, like thyme, rosemary, scallions. Heterotrophs also are carnivores, organisms that eat only meat. These are the top predators of the world, things like lions, tigers, sharks. These are usually very intimidating and few and far between because they need a lot of nutrition to survive. And so these types of organisms eat only meat. The next type is an omnivore. This is what most humans are. Most humans are omnivores, meaning that they consume both plant and animal material. Bears, birds, all types of organisms are omnivores, right? Organisms like chickens are omnivores. They eat seeds and they also eat insects. So all of those are omnivores. They eat both. Omni is a word part that means all. So they eat all the things. And the last one we're going to talk about is decomposers. Decomposers are able to absorb dead organic material and break it down into nutrients or fertilizers. These are things like fungi and bacteria. This is what we see happen to rotten food so that it gets broken down and those chemical parts that it's made up of get returned to the soil so that the next organism that lives can use it to survive, right? Get nutrients from it. So everything gets recycled on Earth. Even rotten apples, right, fungi, all of those things are decomposed so that they can return nutrients back into the soil. Now, when we look at food chains, we look at trophic levels, and trophic is a word part that means that troph, right? Like autotroph, right? It's what it consumes. So these are going to show how energy moves from one organism to another when it gets eaten or consumed. And we're going to number those levels so that we can know what position it occupies on the food chain. So every step in the transfer of energy is a trophic level, right? So on the lowest trophic level or the largest trophic level is going to be producers, right? Then you're going to have things that eat those producers. Then you're going to have top consumers. And eventually there's going to be decomposers that break everything back down. So let's look at this example. At the base, we have green plants. And even though it looks like a small step, you can see that green plants occupy all the way to the back, right, in kind of a pyramid shape. So that's our step one trophic level. At our second level, we have consumers. These are primary consumers. These are usually herbivores, but they can be omnivores as well. These are primary consumers that eat the plants, right? After primary consumers, there are secondary consumers. These are consumers that eat these primary consumers, right? And so on and so forth. And it goes all the way up to these top predators. So these levels get numbered according to how far that particular organism is along the food chain. Producers are at the base. They're always going to be at level 1. All food chains and food webs are going to start with producers. Herbivores are going to be at level 2, right? Those are consumers of plants. And then predators are going to be at level 3 because they're going to eat the things that are on level 2, right? So it's kind of like a stair step. It's kind of easier to think about it like a pyramid. So if you look at this particular pyramid, this triangle, we can see that our trophic levels are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so at the base, we've got those producers. We've got grasses. And so grasshoppers eat the grasses. Frogs eat the grasshoppers. Snakes eat the frogs. And then hawks eat the snakes, right? So it kind of goes up like a food chain would. Speaking of food chain food chains show how energy flows from one trophic level to the next. So if this was in our pyramid, this would be level 1, and the leaf would be level 1, and the snake would be level 2, or the worm, and then level 3 would be the bird, right? And so food chains are very simple and very direct because they're one simple line. They start with a producer, right? Like in our picture, we can see our leaf right there. And then they have a primary consumer, something that eats the leaves. So usually those are herbivores. Secondary consumers can sometimes be omnivores. They eat these and they eat these. And then tertiary consumers are top predators, right? They're going to be organisms that consume lots of meat. So if you look at your list here, we don't see any decomposer in this particular food chain. Decomposers are organisms like bacteria and fungi, and so they're a part of every food chain. So let's look at this one, right? So we've got all of the parts. We even have non-living parts in this food chain. We've got the sun that's providing the energy source for the grass, and then the arrows show the direction that the energy is flowing, right? So grass gets eaten by the grasshopper, grasshoppers get eaten by the snake, snakes get eaten by the hawks, and the hawks, when they die, eventually they're going to be decomposed by different fungi and bacteria. The nutrients that are broken down from their death are going to get returned to the grass, right? So it's a big cycle, right? Everything in science is a cycle. Now, food webs are actually more accurate than food chains because most organisms don't just eat one food source. I know if I had to only eat one food source, I would not be a very happy camper. I like a variety, right? I like my chocolate. I like my candy bars. Oh, wait, that's all the same thing, right? I got to eat my vegetables. I've got to eat some meat, right? All of those things are part of what I eat. And so food webs are a better way to show how food chains can overlap. They're a lot more complex because they show a lot more biodiversity. They show a lot of different types of living organisms in a particular area. So let's look at this food web. As you can see, it is way more complicated than the food chain that we just looked at, but it still starts down here at the bottom with producers, right? Those producers get eaten by all of these consumers. These primary consumers eat those plants, right? And then those secondary consumers, those are going to start to be our predators. Those are going to be the things that eat all of our primary consumers. On the top level are our top predators. These are going to be our tertiary consumers. They eat all of the stuff below. And if we're to remove anything from a food chain, it's going to affect everything else above it, right? Just a reminder, I said this a few minutes ago, but notice that the direction of the arrow is the direction of the energy transfer. It's not showing what eats what, right? So if we look at this food web over here and we look at the seaweed over here, seaweed gets its energy from the sun, and then seaweed gets eaten by these invertebrates, right? It's not going to be the other way around, right? The invertebrates are going to eat the seaweed, not the seaweed eating the invertebrates. So we got to pay attention to the direction of the arrows. Biomass. Well, we know what biomass is bio, which means living things, and mass, which means how much of something we have, right? So the total mass of the organic matter at each trophic level is biomass. And this is important because this is potential energy. Remember, we talked about that transfer of energy. We can't create or destroy it. It's just potential. It's created so that hopefully an organism eats it and uses that energy to survive. That transfer is very inefficient. Only 10% of the energy transfers from one trophic level to the next, which is not very much. That means 90% is lost. That means 90% is used for movement for that organism or lost as heat, because remember, as humans, we have to keep ourselves on a constant body temperature. That's why we have to eat every day, because our body keeps our temperature the same. So let's look at that in an example, okay? So at the bottom, again, we still have our producers, and then we've got 1,000 kilograms. 1,000 kilograms is our biomass, right? If only 10% of that is going to move forward, that means that only 100 kilograms is going to be able to be passed on as energy for that next level, okay? Now, from that next level, those are our herbivores, right? from that level is going to be passed on only 10 kilograms, right? So only 10 kilograms is going to be that primary consumer to be able to use for energy. And then that top carnivore, only 1 kilogram. So from all of this grass, only 1 kilogram of biomass can be put forward to the next level, right? So it decreases in efficiency as we go up. That's why we don't have huge fields of millions of lions, because there's not enough of that base producer to produce enough energy for it to be passed all the way up the food chain, because we lose so much due to energy loss. So energy pyramids, like the ones we've been looking at, show that relationship between those consumers and the producers when we have different trophic levels in an ecosystem. And it sometimes is going to show, like the one we just looked at, the amounts of energy or matter, biomass, contained at each trophic level. And that level is going to show which level has the most energy and the highest number of organisms. So you should have noticed this already, but let's look at another picture. Which level is going to have the most organisms? Which level is the largest? The producers. It's going to have the most energy being transferred up. And as you see these little arrows that are pointing out to the side, every level has energy that is lost just for living, right? Activities that you do during the day, they cost you energy, right? Rabbits running across a field, that costs energy. And so that energy, only 10%, remember, is being transferred all the way up that chain. So 10% from the grass, and then 10% from the bunnies, and then 10% from the snakes, right? So it's very inefficient. We lose 90% just living and performing activities in our day-to-day function. So if you were able to print your notes, you have this already. If you were not able to print them, then I want you to sketch this in your journal. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of things that I want to make sure that you get. I want you to make sure that you label each of the levels in the pyramid with what type of organism resides there. So producers are going to be the base. That's where we have the most organisms. Then primary consumers, then secondary consumers, then tertiary consumers. I also want to make sure that you include both of these arrows. So we've got high energy level down here. The farther up we go, the lower the energy gets. Remember, because we're losing 90% at each level. Over here, I also want you to make sure that you have this arrow that shows population size. So the largest population on a pyramid is going to be the producer level. It's at the base. And so as you go up, the number of population of each type of consumer is going to decrease. Here's a different type of ecological pyramid that you might see. It still looks like a pyramid, but it's based on these boxes stacked on top of each other. And you can see this shows that 10% rule really well. Each time you go up, you get less and less and less, because 90% of the energy is lost at each level. So if I was to ask you which level has the most energy, I hope that you would say producers. If I was to ask you which level has the most organisms, I hope that you would say still producers, right? Lots of producers have to fuel an energy pyramid. If I was to ask you which level has the least organisms, you should say at the very top are tertiary consumers. And then if I was to ask you which level has the least energy, you should be able to tell me it's that very top, the tertiary consumers. That's why you don't see the skies full of hawks, right? Because they need a lot of food and a lot of energy support all the way up their food chain. So let's put something in our notes about the 10% rule so we don't forget, right? No organism gets all of the energy from what they ate. A lot of it is lost. A lot of it is used for daily survival, right? Only 10% passes from one trophic level to the next. We call this the 10% rule. 90% of that energy is lost, used for living, used for heat, used for movement, used to help grow or reproduce. All of those things require energy for our cells. So only 10% gets passed on level to level. Here's a couple more visuals, right? So remember, all energy starts with sun, radiant energy, turns from radiant energy into that chemical energy through the primary producers, right? Those producers that create their own food using energy from the sun, autotrophs, producers. Those autotrophs and producers, they're going to allow 10% right? 10% is going to be passed on to those primary consumers, those herbivores, things that eat plants, right? And so only 10% of that energy is going to get passed on to those secondary consumers, organisms that eat primary consumers, right? And then secondary consumers are only going to be able to pass on 10% of their energy up to those tertiary consumers, right? Here it is again, right? We're showing the heat loss, movement, being able to carry on reproduction and life functions, searching for food. All of those things require energy, and so energy gets lost at each level. Decomposers are impacted by every level because guess what? Decomposers are not picky. They're going to break down whatever is available for them, things like bacteria, fungi. And remember, these kilocalories or kilograms are stored energy, that potential energy, that biomass for each level. So if I give you a quick quiz in this food chain, what is the producer? What's the producer? What's the autotroph? The producer here is the grass, right? And so that means that the primary consumer would be our grasshopper, right? Secondary consumer is going to be something that eats the grasshopper, which is the little mouse. Is the mushroom a tertiary consumer? What do you think? No. Tertiary consumer would be the snake, right? But is everything in this food chain going to be broken down by those decomposers to return nutrients to the soil for those plants to use again? Absolutely. So I hope that you guys have realized that a food chain shows us how energy is passed from one level to the next through organisms creating their own food from energy from the sun, autotrophs, right? All energy source on Earth comes from the sun, right? Radiant energy. Plants, producers, autotrophs, they create chemical energy using the radiant energy from the sun. And then organisms consume that chemical energy in the form of glucose, right? Plants. When we eat plants, it gives us energy. And then we turn that into chemical energy for us to be able to process, to create movement, right? To process all of our foods, to move blood through our body. All of those things help us to go through our normal body functions. So I hope that helps you guys kind of understand what food chains and webs are and how they're different. Tomorrow we're going to do some doodle notes to kind of sketch it out in a visual way so that you guys can maybe put it all together. So I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I'll see you tomorrow.